I'm the publisher of this soon-to-be screen there magazine. So this is our latest issue. As you can see, we like to take on non-controversial subjects like gun control. So this is the quarterly publication of the Skeptic Society, of which most of you are familiar. If you don't have the latest issue, this is just out this week, in which actually we're arguing for a modest amount of gun control, which pretty much launched me out of the libertarian camp for good. Oh well, just got to follow the data where they go. So I thought I'd talk to you today a little bit about my next book, which is The Moral Arc of Science, how science has bent the arc of the moral universe toward truth, justice, freedom, and prosperity. My inspiration for this, of course, is the great Martin Luther King Jr. in his second greatest speech after the I Have a Dream speech is the How Long, Not Long speech, in which he said, how long, not long, let's realize that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. As a sign of that, I just reflecting on what previous speaker said, the fact that even liberals are giving Obama such a hard time about the use of drones, that is actually a sign of moral progress. Considering what we used to do in the Second World War of just carpet bombing massive numbers of casualties, racking up body counts into the tens or hundreds of thousands just to target one particular thing. Here you can target and have collateral damage of only a couple of people. That's huge moral progress, and yet we still give him a hard time for this. So that's a sign of moral progress. So then Massimo and I will talk about this afterwards. He has 3 PhDs. I only have 1, so I'm treading on dangerous territory here. I guess I spent too much time riding my bike and not enough time taking classes. So I started with Darwin's dictum, which I start all my books off with, that all observation must be for or against some view if it is to be of any service. Darwin was reflecting on criticisms he had for his book, The Origin of Species, in which he was criticized for being too theoretical. And he should just stick to the facts. And he said, you know, that all facts are in the service or of something for or against. So my perspective begins with my own evangelical Christian morality in the 70s. So I'm reflecting against this. My point of view is going to be against this, my original morality, which was based in the Bible and religion and the writings of C.S. Lewis, and that's the campus I went to, Pepperdine University in Malibu. Didn't hurt that it was right on the Pacific Ocean, I have to admit, but I was pretty serious about it. And but of course, this is the ask God principle, or the divine command theory. The problem is if God does not decree something immoral, does that make it moral? Thou shalt not commit adultery. If God had not included this, would that make adultery moral? I mean, do you really have to ask God this one? Just ask your significant other. They'll let you know pretty directly. Thou shalt not rape is not even in the Bible. In fact, it's rather encouraged in many cases for the spoils of the victors. So does that make it okay? So in any case, how are we to know God's moral commandments? There's so many holy books and so many religions and only so much time to ask them all. So are we supposed to read the Bible as a moral guidebook and condemn gay marriage and condone slavery? Of course not. And in fact, nobody actually reads the Bible for moral guidance, and that's a good thing. But in my debate since then, since I became an atheist, I've been struggling with where we can find transcendent morality in a universe of blind, pitiless indifference. This quote is often thrown up to us atheists from Richard Dawkins. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. I like the way Richard's smiling there when he says that. It's like just twisting the knife. Well, of course, this is correct on one level, but on another level, I think we can do better than this in terms of answering our critics' criticisms that, you know, without God anything goes. That's not true. That's not true at all, as in the case of the adultery example. Or Ed Wilson's Consilience, in which he writes, either ethical precepts such as justice and human rights are independent of human experience, or else they're human inventions. This split is between transcendentalists, those who think that moral guidelines exist outside the human mind, and empiricists who think them contrivances of the human mind. So in my previous book on this subject, The Science of Good and Evil, I I presented the idea that, in fact, moral behaviors and principles exist outside of us, in the sense of being products of a transcendent force called evolution. As evolution transcends culture, so too does morality transcend culture, because it is a product of natural law. So mine is sort of a natural law theory. Morality is transcendent in the sense of being not just a trait of individual humans. It's not just you and I, but it's part of the species. We get that as being a member of our species. Evolution created the moral sentiments over hundreds of thousands of years in our Paleolithic ancestors. So, Pei said, Wilson, we can be transcendent empiricists in this way. So I think we can do better than religion. We can do better than just blind, pitiless indifference. For example, the first moral principle is to help your kin and kind. And that's an evolved characteristic. That's my kin and kind there, hopefully. She looks like me, right? You're supposed to go, oh, yeah, yeah. There's actually research on this by evolutionary psychologists that in the maternity ward, with the newborn and the father is sitting there next to the mother and the grandparents are there, the grandparents are like 10 times more likely to say, the baby looks so much like the father. And the idea is like just to reassure paternity so that the resources are really going to the right place. Anyway, this was all worked out by Bob Trivers and William Hamilton in the 70s, in which we're most likely to help ourselves and our identical twins, or our parents and our offspring, you know, half our siblings, half siblings, quarter siblings, aunts and uncles, great-grandparents, and so on. That's just the basic selfish gene model of the evolution of morality, or the second moral principle of reciprocity. I'll scratch your back if you'll scratch mine. Bob Trivers there worked out the mathematics of this. So as we climb the pyramid, what I call the biocultural evolutionary pyramid, from the individual to the family, extended family, and community, we have to transition this border here from biology to culture. And so we're kind of up here starting to try to get people to care about the species and the biosphere and biophilia and all that. So that's the hard part. But so now there, Massimo would say, yeah, okay, I'm on board with you there. That's just the evolution of the moral sentiments. So I'm going to go a little bit farther then with this and ask what makes something right or wrong. So we have absolute morality, where moral principles are absolute, this is my position. Moral principles are not absolute, where they apply to all people in all cultures under all circumstances all of the time, as in this non sequitur cartoon. Yes, as a matter of fact, I do have to take everything as black or white. Or as that great philosopher Maxwell Smart said, don't be silly, 99. We have to shoot, kill, and destroy. We represent everything that's wholesome and good in the world. Neither are moral principles relative, determined only by circumstance, culture, and history. I don't care what your lawyer says. They're not called the 10 recommendations. This is often known as the anything goes morality, which I also reject. So instead, I suggest something like a provisional morality, where moral principles are provisionally true. They apply to most people in most cultures, in most circumstances, most of the time. I get this idea from Steve Gould in his definition of a fact in science. In science, fact can only mean confirmed to such a degree that it would be perverse to withhold our provisional assent. I think the second sentence was something like, apples may start to rise tomorrow, but we don't have to teach that in physics classes because it's so unlikely. So in this sense, I think in provisional morality, moral or immoral means confirmed to such an extent it would be reasonable to offer our provisional assent. All right, so I'm going to ask a question on something that's kind of an obvious low-hanging fruit here, of something that's you're unlikely to disagree with, but it'll get us started. Is female genital mutilation wrong? Is this the best we can do? Well, yes, but only in Western cultures. We must respect other cultural traditions and not judge them. Is that really the best we can do for this specific example? I'm not a philosopher, I'm a science guy, so I like real-world examples, not trolley hypotheticals. This is a real-world problem. Can we offer our provisional assent that female genital mutilation is wrong? Yes, we can. Why? Just ask the individual being mutilated and you'll get your answer. If they can't speak words, their screams will give you their answer. Is it absolutely, objectively wrong to deface a woman for any reason? Yes, it is. Why? Just ask the individual being defaced and you'll get your answer. So I call this the ask first principle. To find out whether an action is right or wrong, ask first, as in my adultery example at the beginning. Who do you ask? You ask the individual moral agent who's being acted upon. Why the individual? The individual is the primary moral agent because the individual organism is the principal target of natural selection and social evolution. In this sense, I reject group selection. Natural selection is operating on the individual, and it still works, by the way. These guys are about to win a Darwin Award for taking themselves out of the gene pool early. Thus, the survival and flourishing of individuals is a basis for establishing values and morals, and so determining the conditions by which humans best flourish ought to be the goal of a science of morality. So, female genital mutilation is wrong because it permanently robs individuals of their evolved sexual nature that enables them to flourish. I guess in Massimo's menu there, this would probably be closest to Aristotle's virtue ethics because you have to be true to yourself to live a good life, and if you're robbed of that physically permanently, then you cannot do that. So this is the so-called is-ought naturalism fallacy. The way something is in nature, predation, parasitism, slavery, is not the way it ought to be. Yes, of course. But this does not mean we should always negate the is nature for the ought morality. Since the individual is the primary moral agent, and since the survival and flourishing of individuals is the basis for establishing values and morals, determining the conditions by which humans best flourish ought to be the goal of a science of morality and the aim of a civil society. Now, likely to come up will be David Hume's famous line, long paragraph, long sentence about how you cannot do this, you're not supposed to do this. He actually doesn't say that. He just says, often this shift from is to ought seems to happen without people giving reasons, and all he said was a reason should be given for what seems altogether inconceivable, how this new relation between is and ought can be a deduction from others which are entirely different from it. In other words, Hume is simply saying that to shift from is to ought, one should provide reasons. Well, of course. That's the whole point of using reason and logic in science. All right, so here are some examples of this. Sam Harris's neuroscience studies, for example, both of which I summarize in The Believing Brain, but you can read them directly on Sam's website, in which he shows that in brain scans of subjects answering questions about facts of nature that are obviously right or obviously wrong, or moral judgments that are obviously right or obviously wrong or not certain, are indistinguishable within the brain. There's not like a place in the brain where you evaluate facts about nature and the world, and another place where you evaluate moral judgments. They're in the same place, at least in his two studies. In which then Sam concludes, if I asked him, just give me a one-sentence summary for a slide. So here it is. If believing that torture is wrong and believing that 2 + 2 makes 4 are importantly similar, then ethics and science are importantly similar at the level of the brain. All right, just take another popular topic of gay marriage. So if homosexuality is natural for some people, it's just their nature, they're just born that way, then gay rights ought to be legitimate. Gay marriage should be legal and so forth, and this is an actual tracking moral progress. These are states that have passed anti-discrimination or decriminalization laws. So we're getting there. We're the blue line. Slowly but surely, but it will happen. And by the way, every public talk I give, I have to make this prediction. This will happen. The gay marriage thing will be like the black and white drinking fountain subject in 50 years from now that we'll look back on and go, what were those people thinking back then? But my prediction is this. When all this is cleared and gay marriage is a total non-subject anymore, the Christians will take credit for it. just like they do slavery. They hold up Samuel Wilberforce as the great abolitionist, and that's right, he was. But who is he fighting against? Were his fellow Christians. So in other words, I'll just recommend several readings here, like Christopher Boehm's Moral Origins. His whole theory on the origins of morality has to do with the free riding problem and altruism. In other words, the way a thing is, like bullying and free riding, destroys cooperation and altruism within a social group. Suggests the way things ought to be. So Chris talks about the development of sanctions against bullies and free riders, such as social pressure, criticism, shaming, ostracism, ejection, and even capital punishment. He's got an amazing chapter on how hunter-gatherers handle really nasty bullies. If they just will not bend to the social pressure, they just take them out for a little stroll in the garden and they never come back. In other words, we need a shadow of enforcement by our nature. Massimo mentioned Franz de Waal. I just read his new book on the plane yesterday, The Bonobo and the Atheist, probable title. But so here's a quote from Franz. Is and ought are like the yin and yang of morality. We have both. We need both. They're not the same, yet they're not also totally separate. They complement each other. Values are embedded in the way we are. So our nature is to survive and flourish. A couple more quotes from Franz. Animals ought to feed themselves, escape predators, find mates, and so on. Why? Because that's how they survive and flourish. Social animals ought to get along because that's how the social group survives and flourishes. And human morality develops out of a sensitivity to others and out of the realization that in order to reap the benefits of group life, we need to compromise and be considerate of others. Or Patricia Churchland's wonderful book, Brain Trust. From a biological point of view, basic emotions are Mother Nature's way of orienting us to do what we prudently ought. The social emotions are a way of getting us to do what we socially ought. And the reward-punishment system is a way of learning to use past experiences to improve our performance in both domains. So we know, for example, in famous experiments by, like this one with Fair and Gachter, these are social cooperation games. They're like these behavioral, like prisoner dilemma type games. In this case, a group of subjects around a table are each given a pile of money, and then they can anonymously put some of it into a pot, and however much is put in the pot is multiplied by 1.5 times and then redistributed to everybody equally. So ideally, everybody would put all their money in and divide it up, and then we'd all benefit from this. If it's done anonymously, though, with no opportunity to punish free riders, people start to hold back a few bucks and put a little less in, and then they could try to free ride on the rest of the group. So what happens is, without the opportunity for punishment, the amount of cooperation collapses pretty dramatically. But when you allow transparency to see who's cheating the system a little bit, and you allow punishment of the free rider, cooperation goes right back up. So in other words, by nature, humans are both naughty and nice, so we need social technologies to deal with it. So we have to be aware of lifeboat ethics. Lifeboat ethics is you make some impossible hypothetical thing. There's too many people in the lifeboat's going to sink, somebody has to go. And no moral system gives us the perfect right answer. But what does that mean? Nothing. This no moral system is perfect. It's just the way it is. So, like one of the objections that I often get already, having posted this on Massimo's site, does the ask first principle apply to Hitler? Do we have to ask first Osama bin Laden if it's okay to kill him? No, we don't. It doesn't have to apply in every single case. The ask first principle applies to most people in most circumstances most of the time, but there are exceptions. So at this point, if you disagree with me, or if Massimo is going to disagree with me, I'm going to ask you, in what moral universe is female genital mutilation okay? Is there any moral universe where this would be okay? So I'm going to apologize for the following pictures, but I think it's good, instead of having cartoon hypotheticals, that we look at what we're really talking about here. When is this ever okay? What culture is this ever okay? It isn't. It's always wrong. You cannot sacrifice the individual for the group. So with practical provisional morality, then, moral principles need not apply in every last case for a moral system to be a viable ethical system. Provisional morality is not invalidated with exceptions any more than the moral philosophies of Aristotle, Kant, Bentham, Mill, or Rawls are invalidated because you can think of an exception. All right, so I'll just rifle through these because Massimo already covered these. Kant's categorical imperative. Act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Of course, we don't want to universalize lying and stealing and adultery and so on, so that would make them wrong. But on the other hand, the Nazi comes to your door, it's good to lie. Or Bentham's Utilitarianism, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. He actually generated a hedonic calculus in which you could crunch the numbers by evaluating something based on its purity, its intensity, its propinquity, its certainty, its fecundity, its extent, and its duration. And it looks something like this, which I did as an example in a class, where you have $25 to spend and you have to rank it, your three choices on a 1 to 10 scale, like you got to spend the 25 bucks on a good meal or a good date with maybe sex and a good book. And so you have to just sort of crunch the numbers and you come up with an answer and you decide that, oh, in the long run, I guess the good book outweighs the good meal and so forth. And then you have to universalize this with all people everywhere in all of society, and you need a supercomputer to do this. So obviously the flaws of all these philosophies are obvious. All moral systems have shortcomings, so why not add one more arrow to the quiver of ethics by adding science? So in other words, without worrying about asking Hitler, can we say provisionally that burning this 20-year-old New Guinea woman alive on February 6, 2013 for witchcraft was immoral? Yes, we can. Why is it wrong? Because it decreases the survival and flourishing of the woman tortured and torched. Here's another sign of moral progress. The number of people living on under $1.25 a day has gone down by over 50% since 1990. This is the World Bank source from Bill Gates's webpage there. If the survival and flourishing of the individual is the basis for establishing values and morals, then this graph marks moral progress. Why can we say that's moral progress? Well, you just ask the people who are no longer living on $1.25 a day, and they'll tell you that having more is better than having less. Why? Because it increases their likelihood to survive and flourish. How do you know? You just ask them. Or, as Bill Gates reports, that the number of polio cases has decreased from 350,000 in 1988 to 222 in 2012. Is that a moral good? Yeah. Just ask the 350,000 polio victims who are not polio victims. They'll tell you. Or ask the 5.1 million children under the age of 5 who didn't die in 2011, who in 1990 would have died. Or read the latest, one of the recent issues of The Economist on aspiring Africa, where secondary school enrollment grew by 48% between 2000 and 2008. Malaria deaths have declined by 30%, HIV infections down by 74%, life expectancy has increased by 10%, child mortality rates have fallen steeply. Over the past 10 years, real income per person has increased by more than 30%. GDP will increase by an average of 6%. Africa has 3 mobile phones for every 4 people, the same as India. And by 2017, nearly 30% of households are expected to have a television set, 5-fold increase. Is this moral progress? Yeah, just ask the Africans. Opinion polls show that almost 2/3 of Africans think this year will be better than last, double the European rate. Spread of democracy, all those green blotches are democracies. The shaded ones in between are on their way to becoming democracies. And democracy is good. Democracy has led to better governance. Politicians who want to be reelected need to show results. Armies mostly stay in their barracks. Big man leaders are becoming rare. Warlords like Joseph Kony stand out as an exception today in a downward trend in the decline of power. Africans no longer have to worry about these war criminals from the Liberian Civil War. These are their nom de guerres. General Rambo, General Jesus, General Murder, General Jungle King, Colonel Evil Killer, Colonel Action, Major Trouble, and my favorite, General Butt Naked. He became religious and quit killing people. Okay, so whatever it takes. The number of armed conflicts in Africa is down from 30 a year in 1989 to a little more than a dozen a year today. The number of successful coups fell by 2/3. Is this moral progress? Yeah, just ask this guy. So science tells us that democracies are better for individuals. And this theory goes back to Kant in his book Perpetual Peace. And that was picked up by Rudy Rummel in the 1980s in his book Power Kills. And then this was tested by Bruce Russett and John O'Neill in their democratic peace theory, where they used the Correlates of War project of 2,300 militarized interstate disputes from 1816 to 2001, plus the Polity project that assigns each country a democracy score from 1 to 10. You can't just say a country is a democracy or it isn't. There's a scale. In terms of how competitive its political process, how openly its leaders are chosen, how many constraints and power, and so forth. What they found was that when both countries are fully democratic, disputes fall by over 50%. When the less democratic member of a pair leaned toward autocracy, it doubled the chance of a quarrel. So as democracy increases, violence decreases. And that's good. That's moral progress, which you can track here on the spread of democracies over the last several decades and the decline of autocracies. You can see the effects on human survival and flourishing comparing North Korea to South Korea. This is the GDP per capita. The average South Korean makes almost $20,000 a year. The average North Korean makes $1,100 a year. You can see it in the satellite photos at night, South Korea, North Korea. You can see it in the heights, North Koreans, South Koreans, several inches in difference. Why are democracies good? Because they place more emphasis on individual rights and individual liberty than any other form of governance. In fact, democracies are kind of an ask first principle in action. In that sense, a democratic election is the ask first principle writ large. You ask voters how they feel about an act of legislation or a representative, and they'll tell you at the voting booth. So in that sense, democracy is a form of science in the sense that democratic elections are like scientific experiments. Every couple of years, you carefully alter the variables, throw the bums out, bring some new bums in with an election and observe the results. If you want different results, you change the variables with another election. Note, most of the founding fathers of our country were scientists. As Thomas Jefferson wrote, "No experiment can be more interesting than that we are now trying, and which we trust will in the end establishing the fact that man may be governed by reason and truth." All this is being driven by the Enlightenment idea of reason and science. Individualist societies versus collectivist societies was studied by Ruud van Veenhoven at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. He conducted a comparison of 43 nations on the relationship between happiness with life as a function of three social conditions: individualism, opportunity to choose, and the capability to choose. The data show a clear positive relationship. The more individualized the nation, the more citizens enjoy their life. Here's what the data curve looks like. So it goes up like that. Why are individualist societies better? He writes, one reason is the variation in its lifestyle assortment. The more variation in ways of life, the greater the chance that the individual finds one that suits his or her needs and capacities. The second reason is that individualistic society is more responsive to change in individual demands. The variety of its array facilitates the evolution of new practices, whereas in collectivist societies, new lifestyles meet strong opposition. So, in fact, the whole rights revolutions, of which we're still going through with gay rights and then hopefully atheist rights, is about individual freedom. We no longer see these sorts of things, all just within the last, well, almost got rid of all of them. Now, look, this isn't to deny that we have a social nature, that group cohesiveness can be good. We're very powerful as a species, as a group. To the contrary, one of the most fundamental values is the desire to belong and get along with others, but it has its downside. That is, tribalism is the ugly outgrowth of group cohesiveness. So I'm always worried about the fact that a utilitarian calculus can easily end up sacrificing individuals, permanently damaging them, arguing, for example, with female genital mutilation, that our society is better if we control female sexuality. It's always men making that argument, of course, but that's the problem when you have these kind of collectivist or group utilitarian type arguments. It's too easy to sacrifice the individual. It's always best to ask the individual first. So in conclusion, Martin Luther King was inspired by a 19th century abolitionist named Theodore Parker, who wrote, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience, and from what I see, I'm sure it bends toward justice. Well, we can do better than that. We don't have to divine it. We can study it. We can graph it. We can chart it. We can use science. Science on many levels, by which I mean broadly, reason, empiricism, rationality. Scientific thinking is more abstract. An abstract reasoning expands the evolutionary circle of sentiments. So I'm going to just conclude by just showing you a very interesting chart called the Flynn effect, in which abstract reasoning abilities on the IQ tests have been increasing about 3 points every decade throughout the 20th century. You know IQ tests, it's not the information, arithmetic, and vocabulary questions that you can memorize and study for. Those haven't changed much at all. It's these kinds of, the matrices and similarities, like where you have to take one of those blocks and cubes or checkered figures and rotate them in space and then pick the next one that would go in the pattern, those sorts of things. You can't really study to do better at those. But that's the very thing that people have been getting better at over the last century. James Flynn, this New Zealand psychologist who discovered this, noticed that these IQ test companies have to renorm their tests every 10 years or so because people are just getting better at this. So we're becoming more better able at abstract reasoning. And people in societies with higher intelligence and education commit fewer violent crimes, cooperate more in experimental games like those ones I showed you, hold more classically liberal attitudes, are more receptive to democracy. In other words, if you can abstractly rotate a figure in space and hold it in your brain and picture yourself there or see what the next one is, you can better abstractly put yourself in somebody else's shoes and imagine what you would feel like if something was done to you morally. So I think there's a good argument for a moral Flynn effect, that we're getting better morally. There's moral progress. So the constitutions of human societies ought to be built on the constitution of human nature, and science is the best tool we have for understanding the way our nature is. Even though a science-based moral system is not perfect, it complements philosophical moral systems and allows us to employ empiricism and reason to understand the moral universe. So in conclusion, even though we can't do everything, we can do something to bend the arc of the moral universe toward truth, justice, freedom, and prosperity. And two, in the words on the plaque at the Suez Canal, Apere Terem Gentibus, to open the world to all people. Thank you.